Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Vegan Spirituality Online Gathering. My name's Lisa Levinson. I'm your host, one of the hostess today, and we're very excited to explore veganism as a spiritual path together. That's what we do every month on this online program. And we also have in-person groups that meet to explore veganism as a spiritual practice, and they meet in people's homes or in restaurants and places across the country. We have a group in Los Angeles, there's another one in Philadelphia, and if you're curious to find out if there's a group in the city near you, you can check out the website, which is veganspirituality.com, and there's a groups page. You can also access this through In Defense of Animal Sustainable Activism campaign, which is on the website idausa.org. So thanks again for tuning in. We're excited to have our featured guest, and I will introduce my co-host, Judy Carmen, who's the author of Peace to All Beings, and she will officially introduce our guest today.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. This is Judy Carmen, and I am here to introduce Alan Dale. Lisa and I are really excited to welcome you, Alan. So wonderful to have you with us, and I know our listeners are looking forward to this, too. Alan is an American Tibetan Buddhist and was a disciple of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Hopefully I said that correctly. He is a Lama in the Kagyu, Nyingma, and Gelug lineages. His teachers have included the Dalai Lama, Khensur Rinpoche, Choden Rinpoche, Garchen Rinpoche, Chetsang Rinpoche, among many others. He has been vegetarian and then vegan for most of his life. He is also the CEO of Los Angeles Web Design. So, Alan, you have certainly had an interesting life, my goodness. So please tell us your story of how you became a Tibetan Buddhist. Is Alan there?
Yeah.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Okay,
great.
You are.
Okay, good. So I think my journey began actually before I was born. I think prior lives I had many lifetimes as yogis and mystics and various other different lives that led me up to this life. And then when I was born, I had spontaneous, mystical, and I see Manny there in the background. All right, so I was born having mystical experiences and having transcendental experiences, and I wasn't quite sure what those were meaning. And I started going on a personal soul search, and with that soul search, I discovered all these higher yogas and meditation practices. And that led me into also studying and getting further into various different mystical systems, including on the Buddhist side. And then in the mid-1970s, I met a person named Allen Ginsberg, the poet Allen Ginsberg, who then introduced me to his teacher, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, in Boulder, Colorado, who was running the Naropa Institute. And he then empowered me and taught me a lot of different lessons, most of them private, into the Nyingma and the Kagyu traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And so that's how I got into that whole aspect of Tibetan Buddhism.
Wow, that is very fascinating. So you had transcendental experiences even as a little child?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
well, so
I thought everybody had them. I thought it was a normal thing, and then as I started growing up, I started realizing it wasn't the typical usual aspect, and I noticed that I was a little unique that way. And then when I started studying the various different yoga practices, then I realized it wasn't that unique. There are literally, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that have had some sort of transcendental experience at least sometime in their life, and a lot of that has led them to various different spiritual practices.
Mm-hmm. So, wow. So it seems that many Tibetan Buddhists are not vegetarian, much less vegan, including the Dalai Lama even. So has it been challenging to be vegan among your fellow Tibetan Buddhists? And what kinds of reactions have you received from them being vegan?
Yeah, well, there's a wide spectrum of Buddhism, and there are entire schools and traditions that are all basically vegetarian. And then there are the Tibetans, which are more classically, at least on a cultural and religious basis. They didn't have so much fruit and vegetables on the high plateaus of Tibet, so their tradition, they ate meat. However, okay, so I'm getting weird messages in my headphone here, so if I pause here, I'm getting different messages coming in. So anyway, so with that, whenever I had to go to a specialized training where it was going to be several days or maybe a week or longer, I would always call ahead and see what kind of food that they were going to serve. And then they would ask me if I have any special dietary concerns, and I would tell them. And sometimes they were like, oh, yeah, we're going to have vegan or vegetarian food here. And other times they would say, we're not sure. And I said, well, you need to find out, because if you don't, I'm not going to be showing up. So in many cases, they had to make special arrangements just to have vegan or vegetarian food. Now, that has changed over the years, and now more and more people are turning to veganism and vegetarianism, and most of these events now have that as an option. Within the Sangha or spiritual group itself, many of them, out of respect, don't challenge or say anything about anyone's diet. That's considered disrespectful. But it's interesting when you're at a lecture and they say, well, have love and compassion for all living, have love and compassion to all living beings, and then we take a break for lunch and everybody sits down eating all sorts of meat. Usually I'm not challenged in those times because it's disrespectful, and if you are a bodhisattva or a lama or any kind of monk, you typically don't bring that kind of subject up. I don't know, what more can I tell you about that? So that hasn't really been too challenging for me.
So there's a basic understanding of it, and yet still a lot of meat eating but so when you're saying that it's considered disrespectful to bring it up, you mean either way, either bring it up that you're vegan or you bring it up that they're eating meat, that's disrespectful?
Well, it depends on how it's brought up. You're not supposed to be critical of other people in the group or within the Sangha. Now, interesting enough, and this is another story perhaps, but I had lunch with the Dalai Lama where he sat next to me, and I had the opportunity to have this discussion with him. And that was many, many years ago, but at that time anyway, because he was living in Dharamsala, he typically would eat a vegetarian diet while there at Dharamsala, but when he was traveling, he would eat whatever would be served. It was considered an insult to say anything to the host or whoever that was presenting him the food. And that's also a cultural thing too, is have respect for what people offer you. Now, within the teachings, there's something altogether different. So, if you go to some of the core texts, like the Pali Canon, it says, do no harm, and that includes not eating meat and having love and compassion towards all living beings. Now, there are some people that will challenge that, and then you can go to another text, which would be the Lankavatara Sutra, and in there is a chapter 8 where Buddha is speaking to a bodhisattva who specifically is asking him the question, hey, can you clarify this whole meat eating thing? And the name of the chapter is called No Meat Eating, to give you kind of a a clue of what that chapter is about. But he says, under no uncertain terms, no matter what text or whatever the other people would say about the Buddha, meat should not be eaten at any time, and it's very clear there. So even though a lot of people within the Buddhist community know that, they also know that it's a very addictive type of substance that some people just have their habits. And they actually, if you look on the yogic side, they believe that meat eating is actually more addictive than alcohol or cigarette smoking or most of the other addictions that are out there, that it's a terrible addiction based upon a poison that's introduced into the body, and then you become addicted to that poison from the meat, and it's a very difficult thing to break. And so everyone is on their own path. So as much as I try to encourage people when they have certain options, if I get one of those Rinpoches saying, well, back home, back in Tibet, and on and on and on, they give some sort of story, I'll say, yeah, but that was 20, 30 years ago. Next to the meat that's on the serving counter over there, there's also, vegan options that you could choose from. So at this point, it's not because it's not of a choice. You do have a choice. And I usually will leave it at that. So, but things are also changing. Many of the monasteries, like the monasteries in Dharmasala and also the Karmapa within the Kagyu tradition, now forbids meat from being served in any of its kitchens. And that turnabout has only been maybe in the last 10 years. Also, the Dalai Lama has made every indication to lamas in private meetings to try to stem their meat consumption and not to wear fur or leather or animal products out of compassion. And so the trend now is more going towards a vegetarian and a vegan diet.
That's wonderful news. I wonder if there's a place where we could go online to find out which groups are forbidding meat. You said the Kagyu were forbidding meat in their kitchen?
That was the 17th Karmapa who has stated. Now, he's also restated where in some cases there may be an exception to eating meat, but in most cases, in fact, there was in one of the monasteries that was tied to the Karmapa, they actually had a corral of animals, and they would butcher animals there at the monastery. Well, that's been shut down since then. And more they're saying that, at one time they said, as long as you don't kill the animal and somebody else kills the animal, then it's okay. But now they're changing their position and saying, well, even if somebody kills it, even whether it's on your behalf or not on your behalf, you should not be eating meat. And I think the Karmapa even came out and stated if he sees anyone in the monastery or around the monastery eating meat, he'll have to speak to the Karmapa. So there's a bigger push now that's happening for that, and I think it's just a matter of time. And it's backed by spiritual support, and of course the yogis, they will all say that meat is either tamasic or rajasic, and it has that energy that is negative. And if you're trying to be a bodhisattva and trying to follow the path of love and compassion, you should have more of a sattvic diet, and a sattvic diet does not consist of eating animal products, usually. So you want to try to stem the way of getting away from eating animal products, because not only is there a karmic ramification to that, if you are on the bodhisattva path, you're also trying to generate bodhicitta, which is a certain mindset of love and compassion towards all living beings. Well, it's kind of hard to have love and compassion towards all living beings and then turn around and eat them. So that's not a very compassionate act. So if you're on that path and you're trying to generate bodhicitta, that's what you're trying to do is do everything in your life, including what you consume, to get away from that. Now, the other thing that's interesting is from an esoteric or mystical side, meat actually hampers the advancement of certain yoga and meditation practices. So you have to give up meat in order to purify the nadis within the body or the spiritual channels within the body. So within those systems, they say if you eat a little bit of meat, you have a lot of downfall, and it takes a long time to get back to where you were. So don't eat that poison and then have to detoxify yourself. Just stay away from it and purify your mental, emotional, physical, as well as spiritual self by not eating meat. Because they believe that meat actually affects all those different levels within an individual.
So, but it is moving towards veganism, the trend. But
right.
yet there are sounds like quite a few Tibetan Buddhists who are still eating meat. So they must be feeling the pressure at this point. But yet you have to be careful because you can't be disrespectful.
Right.
And one of my questions was going to be, what are some strategies to use when speaking to them? And you've kind of addressed that, especially because of that respect, which is, of course, is important with everyone that we talk to. But what about some of us who are not Tibetan Buddhists, if we wanted to speak to some, and I've actually tried that a few times myself, because we have a Tibetan Buddhist place here in the Kansas City area, and they serve meatballs and spaghetti for their meals, and I get their brochures, and I have approached them, the Lama, to ask, how do you justify that? And I just get this, what you were mentioning, that in Tibet, they have to eat meat because they can't grow that much food. And
but they're not in Tibet now.
Right, yes, which
right.
I pointed out, but it really didn't help a lot. So if any of us who are not Tibetan Buddhists were talking to someone who was and was still eating meat, what would be a good way to approach them respectfully to try to understand? I think listening is very important, but there may be something more that we could know from
right.
you about how we could approach them.
I think the best resource in all of Buddhism, and like I say, there's a lot of different Buddhists that are out there. One of the texts, the Lankavatara Sutra, they believe is actually the words of Buddha. Now, a lot of them are just, Rinpoches or, advanced siddhas or whatever, or practitioners, or they could have all sorts of different titles that have composed and put together some of these sutras. But the Lankavatara Sutra is highly respected among Zen Buddhists, Han or Chinese Buddhists, and also among Tibetans. And then, of course, there's the Mahayanas that respect that document. And it's a sutra that's about transforming the self, and it's about consciousness and all the different ramifications and levels of consciousness. And within there is a whole chapter where there's a bodhisattva named Mahamati. Mahamati asks all these questions of the Buddha. Tell me this, tell me that. And it goes on and on and on, talking about how under no uncertain terms you should not be eating meat. And he says there will be some text or people that will justify or say that I'm not vegetarian or that I eat meat or what have you. But he says, why would I violate the very first precept of Buddhism of non-killing? This is also tied to ahimsa and having loving and kindness towards all living beings. And they recognize everything. They recognize fish. They recognize birds. They recognize all mammals as sentient beings, all the way down to insects. So that is a very good text because it's very authoritative, and you can always go back to that text and say, well, according to the Lankavatara Sutra, and they're not going to argue with you at that point because it's right in there for them to see it. And Now, there's something interesting about this is the Lankavatara Sutra has been translated quite a bit, and some of the translations that are out there, they have eliminated or not included that 8th chapter for various different reasons. My theory is probably the meat eaters decided to leave that part out called no meat eating. But within that text, there are, you can find some online texts that refer to it. If you just typed in Lankavatara Sutra Chapter 8, it will come up and it will say no meat eating, and it will give this extensive dialogue of what you can say to some of these people specifically. And maybe you could start out the conversation, have you ever heard of the Lankavatara Sutra? Well, most everyone in the Tibetan community or the Chan Buddhist community or the Mahayana or within the Japanese Zen Buddhist community knows about the Lankavatara Sutra. Oh, yes, we know that. Oh, that's a wonderful text. And then you can start quoting from that chapter, and they're like, oh, okay, here you go. You're one of those annoying vegan Buddhists, okay. So, so it's a matter of just reminding them.
How can, Alan, how do you spell that? So we could look that up.
Lanka is in Sri Lanka. Okay, Lanka, Lanka. Vatara, Vatara, Lankavatara, and then Sutra, Sutra.
Okay.
Lankavatara Sutra.
Maybe Lisa could type that in on the chat box for everybody. Yeah, that's great. Great information.
I think the best thing in there is like, why, we hear this and we hear that, and Buddha's like, why would I violate the very first precept of Buddhism, which is not killing? Okay. The other thing that's really interesting that I hear a lot in the Buddhist community is that we spiritually transmute the meat into a spiritual substance that's good for us. And so then I always challenge them. I said, I pretty much studied everything, and I have a lot of restricted text. So within especially the Tibetan Buddhist system, there's a lot of text you'll never see because it's only for lamas and monks, and it's a restricted text for practitioners. And there's all sorts of techniques for a lot of different things, but mainly advanced yoga and meditation aspects. But within there, I've never seen a technique to transmute the energy of meat. So I always challenge them. I go, well, that's pretty clever and pretty interesting. How does one do that, and where within any of the text, either publicly or privately or restricted text, where does that teaching come from? And where is it? And who said it? And who compiled it? They can't tell you because it doesn't exist. There is a old Tantra, I think it's called the Jnana Chakra practice, where some practitioners gorge themselves on meat and alcohol and somehow become spiritually obtained through that. And Chögyam Trungpa actually was one of the first teachers that told me about it. And he kind of used that why he drank alcohol and why he ate meat. He was also a smoker, by the way. So even though he was highly respected, and he was an amazing teacher and one of the first Tibetan Buddhists to come to the United States and have a huge influence upon the Americans, he himself had his own habits and stuff. So even with that, I thought it was interesting, but I said, how would I find out more about this or investigate this? And he says, well, it's not really a common practice now, and people generally don't do it. So I've never had anything out there where I was invited to a Jnana Chakra empowerment or initiation because it's not practiced anymore.
Okay. Well, so on another subject, we would love to hear about your strategies for maintaining inner peace as you are facing, and we all are, the suffering that animals and people in the world are dealing with. And for animal activists, it's, daily that we hear about more suffering. So what are some good strategies that you use for yourself and that you could offer to us to maintain inner peace?
I could do a whole lecture on that.
I'm sure.
Well, I grew up suffering tremendously because I grew up in a farm territory where they butchered animals on a regular basis and would try to get me involved. And of course, me loving animals, I could not ever butcher any of the animals. And so when Butcher Day would come around, whether it was the chickens or the pigs or the cows, I would try to disappear. And I was wondering why I was on such a terrible, horrific planet, and somebody had made a mistake. Either a flying saucer left me here by mistake, or I'm from the future, or I'm from another planet, but this is not my planet. And later on, I got very involved with animal activism. Early in the 1970s, I was doing stuff with Greenpeace, and I was also trying to forbid the trappings of the and killing of the white wolves in Colorado, and I was doing tree tapping, try to prevent some of the old growth forests from being taken down. And I was constantly involved with this stuff, and my heart was just pouring out. And I felt like I was bleeding. It was just the more I got into it, the deeper I got into it, the more horror I would start to experience. And I had to get to a point where I said, look, I can only do so much. The world is all about suffering. It's all part of samsara here. I cannot bring suffering to myself and remain stable within this world and within society. So I had to really work at trying to figure out what I could do to maintain stability. And part of that was looking at myself first and say, how can I stop myself suffering from all of this? And looking at all of this stuff in a proper perspective, do what I can do, but then don't overextend myself. And I've seen a lot of people burn out in animal rights and also the environment, and also become very radical and very dangerous and might even hurt people or blow up labs or whatever. And that's not the way. You want to do it in a nonviolent, loving, compassionate way and not create any suffering in the world. So part of that is going to your inner self. Your heart is your guide, and literally at the heart of all the advanced yoga practices that are out there, they believe the soul is in the heart, and all the advanced yoga practices are regarding the heart. So any kind of heart practice that one can do and try to put things into proper perspective would then help deal with some of all the suffering and all the things that are going on. You can participate when you come from a stable point, and I would highly recommend meditation as a stabling point. So get centered within yourself, get centered within your heart, and eliminate self-suffering first, and then you can go out and try to eliminate suffering in the world.
All right. That's a tall order, but I totally agree with you, and I think we're all working on that, especially our vegan spirituality members and groups. That's one of our big projects is learning to do this, and learning self-care and learning balance. So, and you're out in the world as a CEO of your company. Yeah. So I imagine that you're confronted with customers and employees who are not vegan, and having big barbecues and that sort of thing, and all those people are suffering greatly from the stress of the high-tech world, and also the animals that they're eating are suffering. So what are some of the things that you do to cope and stay peaceful amidst that chaos? Because you're not living in a cave. You're out there in the middle of it all like we are, and dealing with all this on a rapid pace. Yes. Situation. So keeping your center is very tricky in that kind of environment. So how do you take the wisdom you've gained from your spiritual practice and apply it to everyday living?
Well, that's another thing I could talk hours about. But there's no stress in high tech. high tech is probably one of the most stressful things you could ever imagine. And I kind of fell into that career, and I kind of wonder maybe I should have done something that wasn't so stressful. And what's interesting is a lot of tech giants that are out there happen to be not only vegan, but also practice some form of Buddhism. Probably Steve Jobs is probably the most famous one that people would know about, but also the guy that started Oracle and many of the other tech giants that are out there. Veganism is popular, and meditation and Buddhist meditation is very popular. But I think everything comes back to the self by example. I get a lot of people that are very frustrated with technology, and the most important thing is to remain calm and very patient and listen. And things become more stressful when you don't listen. Things become more stressful if you don't let the other person express themselves. Don't have yelling matches. And occasionally I might get a client that will yell and scream at me, and I know it's not something personally, it's something that they're frustrated with technology. And so I wait for them to calm down before I can talk to them. And if they're just totally erratic, I'll just say, you need to call me back when you've calmed down. And that's what I do. And then if they call me back later and they're still yelling at me, I say, you haven't calmed down yet. Center yourself. And I might do a little bit of meditation with them and say, okay, center yourself. Okay, take some deep breaths. Express yourself. Use your words, to get them to get back to it. And usually it's because of a misunderstanding, or they just, something's not working, and one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, and then pretty soon you have all these stressful factors coming in at you from all sorts of different directions. And once it gets to that point, they just lose it. They go frantic. And even the nicest people out there can go crazy with technology. So, and they always say, Alan, why are you so calm? Or I've even had some of them call me up saying, I want to argue with you. Why won't you argue with me? And I said, nothing to argue about. It is what it is. There's this or there's this, and there's nothing to really, I can commiserate, but I don't get angry at that point. So as a tool, I would say in this world we need meditation and mindfulness more than any other time in the history of our planet. We become more and more complicated, and as technology and everything around us becomes more complicated, telephones used to be very easy. I still haven't figured out all the options on my phone. And my car, I got a manual that's 400 pages thick. I've had my car for a long time, and I still haven't figured out all the different stuff about it. Nothing's simple anymore. And that just keeps adding more and more stress. So I would, besides meditation, recommend trying to simplify your life. Try to make things as simplistic as possible. What's important to you? What are your goals? What's important to you? And then try to, maybe something simple like declutter your place, or clean your desk off, or get more organized, or anything of that sort. Because we have so much that's coming in from so many different angles. We want to have relief. And this gets back to self-suffering again. You don't want to suffer. So find ways that you can eliminate suffering in your life.
All right. That's great advice. Thanks so much. Well, we're going to be opening up for questions here in the next few minutes, but is there anything you'd like to add before we do that?
I would just like to say that like a lot of different communities out there, it's not just the Tibetan or the Mahayanas or the Zen Buddhists or the Chan Buddhists. I would say all of Buddhism and all the world is transitioning more towards a vegan diet. It's not a trend. Trends come and go. This has been around too long. It's no longer a trend. I felt so alone when I was a vegetarian and then later on a vegan, because there was no one around me, that was that way. And nobody in my family, none of my friends, none of my school friends. And now, recently I went to a Veg Fest in Orange County, And there was thousands of people there, so I didn't feel all alone anymore. And it's taking, and it's something that's really important for how our society is going to proceed forward into the future. Meat is just not, consuming meat and animal products is just not sustainable. And we're just the early adapters, that's all. So we need to help guide our fellow humans in that direction. And I do see that happening, quite rapidly within the Buddhist tradition.
But that is such great news, and I love that. Early adapters.
Yes. I've always been an early adapter, even with technology. I've always been ahead of the curve. So It's very stressful, but I think more and more people are wising up and getting clued in. And I think the Internet's been a part of it. The Internet has educated a lot of people and helped people along to become more aware of what's going on in the world.
Oh, so true. Lisa, shall we open up for questions?
Sure. This is a good time. So again, my name's Lisa. I work with In Defense of Animals, and we're hosting, Judy and I are co-hosting this vegan spirituality online gathering with American Tibetan Buddhist Alan Dale. So for those of you who just joined us or joined through Facebook Live, just wanted to give you a little update on what we're doing here. And right now we're about to open up our Q&A portion of the program, which means that anyone who has joined us in the webinar, you're welcome to, if you're on the phone with us, you can unmute yourself by pressing star and the number 4. If you are on the computer or smartphone, you can look at some of the icons on your screen, and you can turn your audio on. You can also turn your video on if you'd like to join us in a more informal chat here. There's also the chat box, so you can ask a question there. And those people who are on Facebook Live, you're welcome to ask a question in the chat box on the IDA Facebook page. So for starters, I wanted to mention that there was a question that I noticed that came through. We have a couple already. So one of them you, I think, addressed a little earlier in the program, but I wonder if you might review it, which is why the Dalai Lama is not officially vegan.
Well, I hear different stories. I've heard different things from him. I think the official statement is from his doctor, and he was vegetarian for many years, and then he had a bout with hepatitis. And I think at that time, on a Tibetan medicine level, it was recommended that he occasionally eat meat. Also, it's important to understand that the Dalai Lama is more of a political head. He doesn't have advanced transcendental experiences. He's not an advanced yogi. So he's not experiencing the detriment of meat on that level. When you get to an advanced state of meditation, meat becomes obvious as a detriment, and you have to give it up. So I used to tell my students, I said, don't worry about giving up meat. When you get to an advanced state of meditation, you're going to have to give up meat if you want to proceed, to a more advanced state. But I think the Dalai Lama, being also a statesman and also from his culture and wanting to respect various different cultures, I think that's a part of it. But he says, I do like to eat my rice and lentils there in Dharamsala when I'm at home. So I think when he's there, he tries to eat. He's a transitory vegetarian now with maybe occasional meat eating. But I think when he's given the options out there, and maybe if we have a world that's more geared towards those kind of diets, because a lot of times when I go to an event like that, where that particular event that I went to where I had lunch with the Dalai Lama, your options were beef or chicken. And I think there was fish, okay, but there was no vegetarian or vegan option. So then I called somebody over and I said, can I have some of these side dishes, or could you go back to the kitchen and tell them that I want something that's vegan? And usually they're accommodating, but The Dalai Lama doesn't want to make any big deal about any of that stuff. But I think when it's an option, and hopefully someday they'll say, do you want the vegetarian or do you want the vegan diet? And it won't be between meat, substances. But I think it's time. It's time. But he does tell all of his monks that they should go vegetarian, so vegan if possible. So he does, do as I say, don't necessarily do as I do, because I have my own suffering. And he will admit, and a lot of them will admit, that it's a terrible addiction. It's not easy. It's easier to get off heroin than it is to get off of meat. If you have a really bad addictive personality and you've been eating meat for a better part of your life, it takes a while to transition over. And I think because of this culture, I'm not trying to have justifications of why what he does. He has his own justifications. He has his own path. He's got his own karma to deal with. So, out of respect, everyone's allowed to do what they're going to do in life, and we shouldn't be critical of them.
Thank you so much, Alan. And actually, one of the things that our group in Defense of Animals is doing to help people with that transition is we started a program called Carnivores Anonymous, which is actually addressed at the addictive qualities of meat and people who wanted to make that transition to a vegan or plant-based diet. That's a program, a 12-step support group. So for anybody who's interested, you could look up carnivoresanonymous.org, or if you know friends in your spiritual community who you think might be interested.
It's about time that we have something like that, and I hope it grows and continues.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's just getting started, so please spread the word. There's also, we have a couple of other questions here. How do you handle being in a spiritual community with so many who are violating the first precept, or having some folks who are teachers to you who are violating the first precept? This person's sharing that they have a hard time respecting or having respect or interest in teachers who consume animals. I believe this was from Elaine, who's with us online.
Yeah. Hi, Elaine. So it's a good question. You have to realize that everybody is on their own journey, and everybody is on their own spiritual path. And they are responsible for their own karma and their own life. And so even if they're an advanced teacher, you can still get wisdom from them. You can still get teachings that you can adapt to your own life. Some of these guys are very hardcore. One of my teachers, Choden Rinpoche, was actually a teacher for the Dalai Lama, and he was more of a hardcore, what they call Anuttara, or highest yoga tantra practitioner. And it was really interesting with my experience with that, because I went to a Vajrayogini empowerment with him, and he was very old school. And this is where you drink supposedly blood from a skull cap, and you trumpet with a femur bone, and they throw fireballs down your throat, and you take these bliss pills that's supposed to have all sorts of nasty, crazy things in it. And when I went to the event, I go, so what are you guys using as a blood substitute? And they said, because I don't drink. Sometimes they would use wine, and then they go, oh, grape juice. I go, okay, I could do grape juice. And then I go, I'm really concerned about the bliss pills, because they put some really disgusting substances in the bliss pills. And they said, oh, no worries. The bliss pills are actually vegan. I said, good. Because there's what is called the 5 meats, and there's elephant meat, monkey meat, and dog meat, and all this other stuff that they could put in there, and some other really disgusting things. But even somebody who is as traditional as Chögyam Trungpa, or Choden Rinpoche, he could teach some very advanced teachings, and then also at the same time, even when his own ceremonies, alter his ceremonies to be more of a vegan ceremony. And if I remember correctly, I don't know if he ate meat or not. I never saw him eat meat with any of the buffets and stuff that we would go through, or any of the food that was served. So I didn't approach him on it, but I think he was vegan.
Wow. Well, very interesting. I'm learning so many new things tonight about vegan bliss balls. Um, now, we have another question here. This is from Mark Lane, and he's asking his question. He's wondering about the different reasons that Buddhists might be abstaining from meat. For example, are they for the devotee or more for to prevent suffering of the animals? So I guess one way to say it is are the reasons that these Buddhists are for the benefit of being in the community or to follow the precepts of the Buddha, or are they more about the well-being of the animals?
I think the importance is for them to generate bodhicitta and to truly generate love and compassion towards all living beings and have that mindset. One cannot be consuming animal products because that creates suffering. And ideally, you want to lessen your suffering footprint in the world. Just like in environmentalism, you want to reduce your carbon footprint. Well, here you want to reduce your suffering footprint. And it's not only good for you karmically and for gaining what they call merit, and merit is important, but it's also for generating the right spiritual energy within the self. And that spiritual energy is physical, emotional, mental, and has spiritual ramifications. So if they want to get to the more advanced states, there are certain precepts and things that you must do in order to get to that place. So that knowledge is in the restricted text and is very clear. So if they're following anything that's in the restricted text, and this is sort of the irony too, most of the stuff that's out there on Buddhism, I would never have an interest in Buddhism based upon the books that are out there. And there's a lot of books out there. I only became interested when I started to be given the secret teachings and knowing the hidden teachings. And now there's a movement to try to make more of the secret teachings more available to the public. But unfortunately, most of the advanced stuff within Buddhism you'll never read about or know about in most of the classes or most of the stuff that's taught to the general public. But the hardcore stuff, they start talking about the winds within the body and the pranas and the prana shakti and how the energies flow in the body and how one needs to purify the nadis, and then you have the tigles and the energy balls that can go through the body, and how does one go through a state of purification. And that's, on one hand, a selfish interest, but on a non-selfish aspect is you're not doing it for yourself, but you're actually doing it for other sentient beings, being of service to others and treating animals as your brothers, your sister. In fact, what they believe is that we've had so many incarnations that almost any animal that you would interact with at one time was either your mother or your father or your brother or a sister, and you should cherish them just like you would a loved one. And so part of that is being of service and treating others ahead of yourself, that you are not seeking enlightenment for yourself. In the Theravada tradition, it's more about liberation for the self. But when you get into the Mahayana or the Vajrayana systems, then it's not for the self anymore, because part of it is eliminating the ego, and you're doing it for the betterment of all beings.
Well, thank you for answering that question, Alan. We have a couple other ones for you. And one of them is, the question comes from a person identified as V. It says that vegetarianism is promoted in the Buddhist community, even though it's more cruel and produces suffering, such as with veal, how veal is connected to the dairy industry, because in order to create a continuous supply of milk, the animals are, the babies, the calves are taken, and they become veal as part of the veal industry. So the morals and ethics are very brutal to the female animals, and produce a greater amount of suffering. And so just versus just addressing the eating meat issue. So the question is, why isn't this addressed in the Buddhist community, this idea of vegetarianism versus veganism?
I would say veganism is fairly new, okay, in the world culture. I mean, I knew about it when I experimented with a lot of different diets, including breatharianism and sproutarianism and fruitarian diets and various different diets. And the movement I've seen probably in the last 20 years, and especially here in Southern California, there's, one of my favorite Vietnamese restaurants is ran by some Buddhist nuns, and they have over 80 different vegan dishes, and they're very sweet, and they in themselves with their own tradition, and they're Mahayanas. A lot of Mahayanas traditions promote that. But it just depends, because Buddhism is so broad. So whatever you say in one aspect, yeah, these people are meat eaters, and these people are vegetarians, and these people are vegans. It's all a mix, because when Buddhism spread out throughout the world, they also took on some of the local cultures and local aspects. And then they also took on more seriously some of the spiritual scriptures versus others. So some of the hardcore sutras really talk about not eating meat. Eating meat and cruelty should be eliminated, suffering. And there's even some Buddhists that release animals. They will go to markets where they sell animals, just like the Jains do. And they will buy up all the chickens, or they'll buy up the fish or whatever, and then they'll have what they call these sacred release programs. So they do free a lot of animals as well, very similarly to the Jains. And I know there's one in Santa Monica that does that, where they do a regular fish release. And they'll buy the fish right off the boats that come in before they go to market. Say, we're going to free these fish. And then they'll buy them all up. So the fishermen get their money, but then they go out and they release these fish back out into the ocean. And I've also seen it with goats and with other things, too. I'd really like to see more animal sanctuaries created in the name of Buddhism, where they then start to take some of these animals and transition them to these sanctuaries, so that at least they're taken away from these slaughterhouses and from these predicaments, and maybe used as an educational tool to make people more aware of the suffering that's involved. We really have a blind eye to what's going on in the world out there, or most people have a blind eye. And when you start doing spiritual practice, you start to awaken. Part of it's the third eye that's awakening, but you start to see things that other people, you would think they would see, but they don't. Even if it's right in front of their face, they have an empty relationship to the suffering or the brutality of what's going on. And so, and I see it everywhere, and I really try to take it to account for myself. If I don't know, not too long ago, there was a woman walking her dog over in Beverly Hills, and she picked up a stick and was just beating this animal horribly. And I had to stop my car. There was no place to park, so I stopped it right on the road. Everybody's honking at me. What are you doing? I had to react in a very calm way. I went over to her, and I took the stick from her arm, and she's just like, "Don't hurt me." I said, "I have no plans of hurting you, but do you realize how brutal? Do you realize what you're doing to your dog? Do you love your dog?" She says, "Of course I love my dog." And then I said, "Well, why are you beating your dog?" So there are people that will do things that they don't even realize what they're doing. So it takes us, people that are awake, to go out and try to awaken these people and let them know. And, and it's, with someone else within the vegan spirituality group, we were thinking about putting together a bill that would make it a requirement to have cameras up in slaughterhouses, so that people would bear witness to what's occurring. And since it's not self-monitored, at least the people could monitor what's going on. And I think if there was more, just like Paul McCartney said, if slaughterhouses had windows, everyone would turn vegan. Well, what if they had cameras set up there? And I think it should be a law. I mean, there are some European countries that are talking about that. And that's getting a little bit away from Buddhism, but I think it's a responsibility for everyone, including Buddhists, to try to create more awareness of what's going on out there.
Mm-hmm. And then this may be our last question, which is, what are the most powerful suggestions to win over a spiritual meat eater? Someone who describes themselves as a spiritual person, and yet they eat meat, eat other animals, let's say.
I think part of it is to help them become self-aware. Say, would you be more or less spiritual if you were to eat meat or not eat meat? And pose the question both ways. And let them reflect upon it. Buddha said in the Lankavatara Sutra that not hurting animals, not using their products, is akin to spirituality. There is no separation between that. So in fact, veganism is an attribute of spirituality. So that was one of my things that I was attracted to vegan spirituality as a group, is they go hand in hand together, and Buddha talks about that in the Lankavatara. So I think it's a matter of giving the person the question so that they can ponder upon it. They're not going to listen to you. You can't change anybody's mind just by talking to them. But if you can get them to create an internal dialogue within themselves and just say, would you be more spiritual if you gave up meat? Or do you think you're more spiritual by eating meat? And I think if you just pose that question, they'll walk away. They may give a flippant answer, but that's going to plant a seed that they're going to play in their head over time, and they're going to create an internal dialogue that will then resolve itself.
I like that suggestion. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good one. To also bring that information back into their own consciousness so that they can reflect upon it and maybe make a new choice.
Yeah, because you can't change people, really. They have to change themselves.
So true.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a moment and just thank you, Alan, for sharing all of your wisdom with us. I know you have such a deep knowledge of the different Buddhist systems, and I think it's really been a wonderful benefit to our community to hear about them and a bit about your journey. I know you wanted to, we do a special closing usually at the end of our group, and we're coming to that time. So I was wondering if you might want to share one of a Buddhist meditation with us.
Yeah, this is a meditation and also a practice, and something that's very simple. And in Buddhism, you have a moving meditation or a sleeping meditation or a dreaming meditation or a seated meditation. So this falls into a class of moving meditation along with mindfulness. And this is something that you can do as a ritual and tie it to the foods that you eat. So for every meal, you get to practice a little bit of a spiritual practice along with the food that you eat. So the mindfulness that you want to tie to this is, no matter what you're eating, ask yourself if what you're eating has any suffering involved. So, if there happens, let's say you're a vegetarian and there's egg or dairy in it, try to tie it to any possible suffering that's out there. And say, as I take this into myself, is there anything that's connected to suffering here? And if there is, then maybe next time they can do better and try to eliminate things that are suffering or suffering aspects. And even if you're a vegan, there's always suffering with the food that you eat. You could be eating some nice vegan chocolate that maybe used some poor child as labor, that might have been suffering in Africa to help get that chocolate to the Western world. Or you could be eating some nice organic produce, but instead of locally grown, maybe it was put on a ship in China, and then there was all these toxic diesel fuel that was contributing to global warming, and that is eventually going to create suffering. So think about what you can do to lessen the suffering. And while you do this, there's a short version and a long version. So the long version, which isn't too long, is just a simple mantra of Om, Ah, Hum. And as you do this, you do it 3 times, and you visualize in the forehead a white orb and the seed syllable. You say this internally to yourself, Om, and you tie it to the in-breath. And then as you hold your breath momentarily, there's a syllable called Ah, and that is a red orb at the throat area. And then as you exhale, you have a blue orb in your heart called Hum. As you breathe in, Om, and then Ah, and then Hum. And you do it 3 times, and this is a centering aspect. And then once one is centered, then one can then have that mindfulness of the food that they're eating and figure out in what I eat, in what I'm eating, is there suffering associated with that, and then how can I do better next time? Now, you can't always do this in a restaurant, especially with people saying, can I take your order? Or is there anything else you need? So a shorter version of it is just to have the letter Hum in the heart and have a radiance of loving compassion towards all beings. In fact, that's a good conclusion of the Om Ah Hum, and then the intention, and then at the end, have a Hum with a blue light emanating into all directions, all 10 directions, with the intention of loving compassion towards all living beings. And so you can start your meditation with Hum, and then you can end your meditation with Hum.
That's a beautiful practice to share with us. Thank you so much. So it's this idea and with the different orbs and different colors and the sounds. So thank you. That's something that we can each take home and practice.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
It's a very basic practice, and then as people learn more about it, there's a lot more to it that goes along with it. But that's a very simple practice that you can apply towards each meal that you eat, and also have the mindfulness of what you're eating. A big part of your practice is just being mindful of all things at all times.
Mm-hmm. No small order.
Takes time. Practice.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this with us, Alan. And also wanted to mention for those people who are based in the Southern California area, many of us are so fortunate to have Alan be part of our vegan spirituality groups in the Los Angeles group and also the Orange County group. Alan has come to our groups and shared his knowledge, and so I'm very honored to be able to share your knowledge with the rest of the IDA community in defense of animals, and also with our vegan spirituality community as part of the Sustainable Activism campaign. So thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. And we hope that that the rest of the community here, that everyone can tune back in. We always meet on the second Thursday of each month, and we've been spiritual leader in the community, and then have an interview and get to know them and their work. So we look forward to our next gathering, which will be in December. So meanwhile, thanks to everyone for joining us, and to Judy for doing the interview, and Alan for again sharing all your insights. And we have people who are part of our group who are saying thank you, and on our Facebook page they're also reiterating thank yous. So that's a wonderful way to end our evening with a large round of gratitude, especially since we have the holiday of gratitude coming up in terms of the Thanksgiving holiday. So thank you so much. And for those who want to spend Thanksgiving with others like-minded souls, if you're in the Los Angeles area, there is a large vegan Thanksgiving potluck that usually has about 300 people at it, and you can find out more about that on IDA's Facebook page. And if you are not in the area but would like to have a sense of solidarity with others, I will be leading an activist support group on Thanksgiving. So if you could sneak away for an hour, even if you're with your family, if you would like to have a little moment of solace with others who also are practicing a compassionate Thanksgiving, you're welcome to have an opportunity to talk about what does it mean to be vegan or vegetarian in a non-veg world, and to be able to have support for those choices that we've made. So you're invited to do that. You can find out about that event on our events page, which is idausa.org/events. So many blessings to all of you. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It was wonderful.
All right. Good night.
Night.